Some stories aren't meant to be told in passing. They demand to be felt, lived, remembered. What you're about to witness is one such story. A tale of love, loss, and loyalty that defies time, wrapped in the silent footsteps of a pitbull named Rocco. Welcome to Veil Marks, where we uncover the marks left behind by those who loved us most and never asked for anything in return. This isn't just a video, it's a lesson, a legacy. So watch closely, all the way through, because as the old saying goes, sometimes it's the quiet hearts that make the loudest echoes. The cold blue light of the veterinary clinic cast long, sterile shadows across the walls, swallowing warmth, memory, and time. Claire Harper sat cross-legged on the floor, cradling the emaciated body of her beloved pitbull, Rocco. Her fingers trembled as they moved slowly through his thinning fur, pausing now and then at the sharp ridges of his ribs, a silent map of the battle he'd been losing for weeks. He was barely more than a whisper of the dog he once was, once a powerful canine rescue dog with fire in his stride, now reduced to shallow breaths and the faintest flicker in his tired eyes. Claire was 38, not old, but old enough to carry losses. Her hands, calloused from a past life working structural reinforcements along dam systems in rural Tennessee, were now wet with tears she couldn't seem to stop. In her mind, she wasn't just letting go of a dog. She was saying goodbye to the last thread, tying her to a life that had washed away 6 years earlier. "It's okay now, Rocco," she whispered, pressing her forehead to his. "You don't have to fight anymore. You already did more than anyone ever asked." Rocco didn't move, but his ear gave the faintest twitch at the sound of her voice. He had always known her voice, responded to it even when he was half buried in floodwater debris, when she'd screamed his name the day the dam broke. He had known it then, and he seemed to know it now, though barely. Outside the clinic, rain began to fall softly, almost apologetically, as if the sky was reluctant to witness the end. Inside, everything was still, except for the gentle beeping of a monitor and the sound of Claire's uneven breathing. Dr. Eli Morgan stepped quietly into the room. He was in his early 60s, a quiet man with kind eyes behind square glasses, and the sort of calm that came from decades of ushering families through final goodbyes. In his gloved hand, he carried a small syringe. His face wore the practiced compassion of someone who had done this more times than he wanted to count. Claire looked up at him and gave a small, shaky nod. "We're ready," she said, her voice nearly inaudible. "But Dr. Morgan paused. Instead of kneeling down beside them, he hesitated a few feet away, his gaze narrowing. He tilted his head slightly, stepped closer to Rocco, and crouched down. His eyes scanned the dog's face, his fingers reaching to lift Rocco's lip gently, examining the gums, the sclera of his eyes. The syringe lowered slightly in his hand. "Wait," he muttered under his breath. "Something's off." Claire blinked. "What do you mean?" Dr. Morgan didn't answer right away. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small penlight, flicking it on and guiding it across Rocco's pupils. Then he placed 2 fingers against the dog's abdomen, applying light pressure, his brow furrowed deeper with each passing second. Claire felt her chest tighten. "Dr. Morgan, I've seen this before. Not often, but this doesn't look like end-stage organ failure. His eyes, they're jaundiced, yes, but the pattern isn't consistent with what I expected to see, and he's warmer than I anticipated." "That's not normal for a dog whose systems are shutting down," Claire stared, caught between confusion and grief. "But he hasn't eaten in days. He can't walk. He didn't even lift his head when I said ride." Morgan nodded. "I know, and I'm not saying he isn't sick, but what I am saying is we may not be dealing with a terminal condition. Not yet. Not today." The syringe was set gently on the countertop. Claire blinked, trying to make sense of what she'd just heard. "What are you saying?" she asked. "That we shouldn't go through with it." "I'm saying," he said carefully, "that if you'll allow me, I'd like to run a few more tests. I want to stop the medication he's on, monitor him for 72 hours, and see what changes. There's a chance, and I don't want to give you false hope, but there's a chance he's reacting to something that might be reversible." Claire could barely process it. Moments ago, she had walked into this room to say goodbye. She'd held Rocco in her arms, whispered everything she needed to tell him. She had made peace with his passing, or at least she thought she had. And now she looked down at Rocco. His eyes were cloudy, but they were watching her, still aware, still alive. She nodded slowly. "All right," she said, swallowing. "One more week, Dr. Tinone." Morgan gave a faint smile. "That's all I ask." He stood, gathering the syringe and returning it to the tray as gently as someone might handle a child's keepsake. "We'll postpone the procedure. I'll need to do a blood panel, and we'll adjust his care regimen starting today. I'll waive any fees for now." This isn't about money." Claire stood too, still cradling Rocco as best she could. Her knees were stiff from the cold floor, her heart heavier than she ever remembered, but somehow it now held a tiny ember that hadn't been there moments before. Hope, thin and fragile, but real. As she helped Rocco back into her car and wrapped him in his favorite blanket, she found herself whispering not goodbye, but something different. "We're not done yet, are we, boy?" The only response was a faint exhale and a barely their wag of a tail, but it was enough. They were going home together. And this time, not to say goodbye, but maybe, just maybe, to fight again. 6 years ago, the world Claire Harper knew was swallowed whole. It had started like any other shift. Claire, a structural engineer with the State Water Safety Department, had been overseeing routine stress testing at the Haven Creek Dam. It was a quiet Friday morning, and the reports all said the dam was holding, that the storm system moving in was just a moderate threat. But storms don't always follow forecasts, and concrete doesn't always hold. Claire still couldn't remember the exact moment it gave way, only the deafening roar that followed, and the sickening lurch of the earth beneath her boots. The next thing she remembered was water, endless, brutal water, cold and fast, dragging her body through twisted metal, broken timber, and the remnants of a world that had collapsed in seconds. They told her later she'd been unconscious when they found her, that she'd been minutes from hypothermia, clinging to a splintered piece of guardrail, half submerged in the current. But Claire remembered the moment right before everything went black, a powerful force pulling at her jacket, teeth, then the soft scrape of a paw, and eyes focused, fierce, refusing to let go. That was the first time she met Rocco. At the time, he was a highly trained K-9 with the Regional Search and Rescue Unit. Muscular, alert, and built like a tank, Rocco had been deployed with his handler, Officer Jake Wells, as part of the first emergency response team into Haven Creek. Jake never made it out. The official report said he'd gone under after saving 3 trapped workers near the control gates. Witnesses described him pushing people toward a rescue boat, refusing to leave until everyone was accounted for. Claire never met Jake, but she thought of him often, in quiet moments, in storms. When Rocco would jolt awake in the middle of the night from a dream he couldn't shake, because after that day Rocco didn't go back to the unit. There was talk of reassignment. Some suggested pairing him with another handler, others pushing for early retirement due to trauma, but none of those options sat right with Claire. Not after what he had done, not after the way he'd stayed with her in the mud, lying beside her broken body until help came. So she filled out the paperwork, navigated the bureaucracy, pleaded when she had to, and in the end, they let her bring him home. It wasn't simple at first. Rocco didn't understand the quiet pace of civilian life. He slept in doorways, stood guard by the window, and flinched at the sound of running water. Claire understood. She had her own cracks beneath the surface. She couldn't step into a shower without checking the pipes, couldn't sleep without checking the door twice, couldn't forget the smell of floodwater soaked into her skin. But somehow, they fit together. Claire traded her high-stakes engineering role for quieter freelance work, safety assessments, technical writing, enough to pay the bills, but not enough to drown her in reminders. She bought a small cottage on the edge of town, with a yard big enough for Rocco to stretch his legs, and walls thick enough to muffle his nightmares, and her own. In the beginning, they healed in silence. Rocco rarely barked. He didn't fetch, He didn't play, but he followed her from room to room, always watching, always present. When Claire woke from dreams soaked in memories of churning water and mangled steel, he was there, resting his head on her chest until her heartbeat steadied. And when Rocco whimpered in his sleep, legs twitching in phantom swims against an invisible current, Claire would kneel beside his bed and run her fingers through his fur, whispering the same words he once seemed to say to her in that flood. "I've got you. You're not alone." That was the quiet miracle of Rocco. He didn't ask for attention. He didn't need a crowd. He was never the dog that drew gasps at the park or chased squirrels down the block. He was simply there, a presence, a promise, a link to the life Claire had before the water came. And over time, a new life grew around that link. Claire had never really believed in soulmates before. Not in the way movies painted them. But what she had with Rocco went beyond language, beyond companionship. He wasn't just the dog who saved her life. He was the last living witness to it. The last piece of her before the headlines, before the funerals, before the nights she stood in the hallway, staring at the guest room that would never again hold her brother's guitar or her father's Sunday newspaper pile. Rocco was the final ember of that fire. And even when his joints began to stiffen, even when his eyes lost a bit of that youthful sharpness, Claire never saw him as old. She saw him as enduring. He had endured what most creatures couldn't. Not just the flood, but the grief that followed. He had never asked for love, but he gave it anyway, in the way he greeted her at the door, in the way he leaned his weight against her knee after a bad phone call, in the way he sat beside her in silence on the anniversary of the flood, watching the river move in uneasy silence. And now, 6 years later, in the sterile blue light of the veterinary clinic, she faced the possibility of letting go. Claire didn't know what would come next. How do you say goodbye to the soul who dragged you from death and anchored you through the aftermath? How do you release the last fragment of the life that shaped you? The answer, she suspected, was, you don't, not really, not all at once. You just carry it the way Rocco once carried her through water, through pain, through silence. You carry the weight of that love, because letting go doesn't mean forgetting. And even if this morning had started with goodbye, perhaps it didn't have to end that way because Rocco was still here. And maybe he wasn't ready to let go yet either. It began with small things Claire Harper tried not to notice. Rocco didn't charge down the porch steps like he used to. He hesitated now, his body stiff, legs trembling slightly after long naps. He wasn't barking at the mail truck anymore, not sniffing the backyard fence where the squirrels ran, not even meeting her at the door when she got home. Then came the more obvious signs. His once bright eyes dulled to a troubling yellow. Patches of redness bloomed around his muzzle and down his chest. He started skipping meals, first his kibble, then even the homemade chicken and rice Claire had always used to coax him when he was being picky. She told herself it was age. Rocco was nearly 10 now, and for a working dog who had pulled her through floodwaters, slept on hospital floors, and braved sirens and storms, that wasn't young. But this didn't feel like old age. This felt like something slipping away. The vet doctor, Eli Morgan, ran tests, checked joints, drew blood, frowned deeply when he saw the x-rays. Advanced osteoarthritis, he said gently. It's common in dogs, his size and breed, especially ones who've worked as hard as Rocco has. Claire nodded, barely hearing him. Her eyes were locked on Rocco, who was lying quietly at her feet, panting softly, clearly in pain. There's a new medication, Doctor, Morgan continued, pulling out a brochure. Canidex G. It's shown promise for older dogs, with joint deterioration, fewer side effects than the traditional steroids. It's not cheap, but some dogs respond very well. Claire didn't hesitate. She filled the prescription that same day, drained the last of her savings account without a second thought. Rocco had saved her life. The least she could do was try to save his. The first few days, Claire thought she saw improvement. He moved a little more easily, his tail wagging faintly when she came home, She let herself believe. Maybe they had more time than she feared. But within 2 weeks, things changed. Rocco stopped eating entirely. His gums turned pale. His breathing grew shallow, almost wheezy. He trembled constantly, even in sleep, and when Claire tried to lift him into the car for another vet visit, he whimpered a sharp, broken sound. She'd never heard from him before. Dr. Morgan adjusted the dose, suggested supplements, ran more tests, but the results only brought more questions, not answers. He's not responding, he said softly, during their third visit. In fact, he's declining faster than expected, is it? The medication? Claire asked, her voice trembling. It's hard to say, he admitted, but sometimes, even the best-intentioned treatments can have unexpected results. At home, Claire sat on the floor beside Rocco's bed for hours, watching his chest rise and fall. Sometimes it took too long between breaths. Sometimes she caught herself holding her own breath with him, terrified it wouldn't rise again. That night, for the first time, she let herself ask the question she had been avoiding. Is it time? Could she watch him fade like this, day by day, breath by breath? Or was it more loving, more humane to help him go peacefully, surrounded by the person he had chosen to protect? Claire didn't sleep. Instead, she stayed up with Rocco, the lamp casting a warm circle of light around them. Like a sanctuary, she pulled out an old notebook from the drawer, the one she used to keep in the field, filled with diagrams and safety protocols. She tore out the first few pages and began to write, Dear Rocco, how do I thank a soul like yours? She wrote for hours, about the flood, about the days she couldn't get out of bed, and he simply stayed beside her, asking nothing, giving everything, about the storms he'd seen her through, real and metaphorical, about how he had taught her that survival wasn't just about breathing, but about living, about showing up for someone else, for yourself. She wrote until her hand cramped, until the ink smudged with tears. She didn't bother to wipe away. And when she was done, she folded the letter carefully and placed it beside his food bowl. It was meant to be read aloud the next day, at the clinic, during those final moments. A eulogy, a tribute, a love letter. Morning came too soon. Rocco didn't move when Claire stood. She knelt, brushing his fur back gently. Hey, buddy, she whispered. Today's the day. He lifted his head, just barely, his cloudy eyes meeting hers. There was no fear in them, just tiredness, trust. It broke her. She dressed slowly, choosing the same sweater she had worn the day they left the flood recovery unit. It still smelled faintly of river silt and smoke and dog shampoo. She packed Rocco's favorite blanket, the old leather collar she had kept from his K9 days, and the worn tennis ball he hadn't touched in months. And finally, she picked up the letter, slipped it into her coat pocket. It felt like carrying a piece of her soul. As she opened the door to the gray morning outside, she looked back one last time at the home they'd built together, the house of quiet routines and unspoken healing. She whispered, Let's go say goodbye, boy. But neither of them knew then that goodbye wasn't coming. Not today. Claire stopped giving Rocco the Canadex G on the fourth night. After the almost euthanasia, it wasn't a decision she made lightly. Dr. Morgan had suggested it after noticing inconsistencies in Rocco's symptoms, things that didn't line up with the expected course of arthritis. He'd said, just stop the medication. Let's observe. She had clung to the hope like a lifeline. And 3 days later, something changed. Rocco, who hadn't lifted his head in over 24 hours, slowly got up and wandered into the kitchen. It wasn't a dramatic return to health. He still limped, still wheezed, but he sniffed his food and took a few bites. And he wagged his tail just once. But it was enough to make Claire pause, enough to make her question everything. Claire Harper was many things. A survivor, a dog mom, a woman still healing from grief. But beneath it all, she was still an engineer. Her mind was built for systems and logic, and something about Rocco's sudden decline and fragile recovery didn't make sense. She pulled out her laptop that night, and began a spreadsheet. Dates, symptoms, dosages. She combed through every entry in her vet bills, every line in the medication brochure, every note she had jotted in her personal journal about Rocco's behavior. Then, methodically, she began cross-referencing. By morning, a disturbing pattern had emerged. Rocco's steepest decline had begun exactly 11 days after his first dose of Canadex G. The redness, the jaundice, the disorientation, all of it coincided. Still, a gut feeling wasn't proof. She called Dr. Morgan. "Can we test the medication itself?" she asked. He hesitated, then said, "It's not standard, but I know a lab that owes me a favor. Bring the bottle." Claire packaged what was left of the Canadex G, along with one of the unused refills, and delivered it to the clinic within the hour. "It would take a week," the lab said. "Maybe 2. While they waited, Claire dug deeper. She found online forums, small, scattered ones where other dog owners had voiced eerily similar concerns. "My dog was fine until Canadex G," one woman wrote. "We thought it was old age. Turns out it was liver failure." Another mentioned neurological symptoms: seizures, collapse, confusion, all in senior dogs. Claire messaged them, collected stories, compared notes. She started building a map of where these cases had occurred: Ohio, Pennsylvania, Georgia, Montana, and in every case, the dogs were older, larger breeds, all on Canadex G, all with rapid, inexplicable decline. She compiled it all into a growing document on her computer, organized by state, symptom, breed. Then the lab results came back. Dr. Morgan called her in. "We found something," he said as he pulled up the report. "There's a stabilizing compound in Canadex G we didn't know about. It's not listed in the main ingredient label, only under a trade name." He pointed to a chemical name Claire didn't recognize. "It interacts with a specific liver enzyme found predominantly in older dogs," he explained. "In most, it does nothing, but in dogs with a certain genetic marker, it causes acute liver inflammation. Essentially, the medication becomes toxic over time." Claire's heart sank. So it was the drug. Dr. Morgan nodded. In Rocco's case, almost certainly, the revelation felt like a betrayal, not just by a pharmaceutical company, but by a system Claire had trusted. She had been feeding poison to the dog, who had once dragged her out of drowning water. She had thought she was saving him. The weight of it crushed her. But there was no time for grief, only action. Together with Dr. Morgan, Claire began compiling an official case file. They gathered blood work, x-rays, photos, and testimonials from other pet owners. Claire sent formal letters to the FDA's veterinary division and to the pharmaceutical company behind Canadex G Petrox Labs. At first, she heard nothing. Then, strange things began happening. One morning, Claire woke to find her front door ajar. She was certain she had locked it. Nothing was stolen, at least. Not at first glance, but her desk drawers had been rifled through. The folder containing Rocco's recent medical documents was gone. 2 nights later, someone broke into her backyard shed and left the gate open. Rocco, still weak but improving, had wandered outside during the night. She found him vomiting near the garden. Panic-stricken, she rushed him to the clinic. The tests showed trace amounts of ethylene glycol, commonly found in antifreeze, a deliberate poisoning attempt. Claire's world tilted. Dr. Morgan called the police, and they opened a report, but without clear evidence. There was little they could do. "You're onto something bigger than just a bad batch of meds," he told her quietly. "Someone doesn't want this going public." Claire couldn't believe it. Or maybe she just didn't want to believe it. But the facts were undeniable. Her files were stolen. Rocco had been poisoned. And the moment she stopped giving him Canadex G, he began to recover. She felt the fear, the violation, the anger. But above all, she felt the responsibility. They had nearly killed Rocco once. She wouldn't let them do it to someone else's dog, no matter how deep this darkness went, Claire was going to follow it to the end. The call came just after sunset. The sky outside Claire's kitchen window still glowing with the golden hues of late summer. She didn't recognize the number on the screen, but answered anyway, half expecting another anonymous threat or a cold-voiced lawyer trying to intimidate her into silence. Instead, she heard a warm, gravelly voice. "Ms. Harper? Name's Lou Bennett. I think we've both known the same dog." Claire's breath caught. "Rocco. That's the one." Lou explained that he was Rocco's first handler, years before the Pitbull had ever worn a canine vest or pulled her from a flood. Now 75, retired, and living in the outskirts of town, Lou had read about Claire's investigation in a small local newsletter that had picked up the story from online forums. "I figured you might want to know who he was before he became a hero," Lou said. Claire found herself driving out to Lou's modest farm the next day, a place that smelled like hay, old leather, and wood smoke. He greeted her at the gate with a slow smile and an even slower walk, leaning heavily on a cane that looked like it had survived a war. Inside, over mugs of strong coffee, Lou began to talk. His voice was steady but gentle, the kind that carried a lifetime of patience and long days with animals who didn't always make the cut. Rocco was different, he said, full of fire, smart, but didn't look the part. Too bulky, they said. Too much Pitbull, not enough Shepherd or Lab. They had this idea of what a search and rescue dog should look like. Claire listened, captivated. He failed his first evaluations. Lou went on. Wouldn't heal on command. Got distracted. They wanted to drop him from the program. But I saw something else. Lou leaned back in his chair, eyes distant with memory. Rocco didn't obey because he didn't trust yet. But once he did, once he believed you were worth following, he'd walk through fire. He paused, letting the silence stretch before adding, "I worked with him for nearly a year. Got him certified. When my arthritis got too bad, I handed him over to Jake Wells. Good man. Better trainer than me, maybe. But it was Rocco's heart that made him special. That dog never gave up on anyone." Claire wiped at her eyes. "I owe him my life," she said softly. "But I didn't realize how much more I owed him." Lou became a steady presence after that, a mentor of sorts, not just for Claire, but for the weight she carried. His age gave him a kind of gravity. His stories a quiet wisdom that comforted even as they unsettled. "You know," he told her one morning as they walked Rocco slowly around her backyard, "it's always the ones, folks write off, that end up mattering the most. The mutts, the misfits, the dogs that weren't bred for glory. People too," Claire smiled. "That sounds like a sermon," he chuckled. "Maybe it is. We need reminders, especially now." Rocco was improving but slowly. His liver function was still being monitored. The police had no leads on who poisoned him, and Claire's investigation had hit a wall of corporate silence. That was when Lou surprised her again. "I want to help you talk to someone," he said. "A man I knew once. He runs the company behind Canadex G, Biopetra. His name's Gregory Harmon. We haven't spoken in years, but if he remembers me, he'll listen." Claire's first reaction was disbelief. "He's the CEO," Lou shrugged. "Doesn't mean he's not human. They arranged a meeting at a quiet coffee house just outside the city." Claire wore a blazer she hadn't touched in months. Lou wore his best flannel and brought a folder of notes, written in old-school cursive on yellow legal paper. When Gregory Harmon walked in, Claire felt tension coil in her shoulders. He looked like every corporate executive she imagined, polished, tailored, composed. But when his eyes landed on Lou, they softened immediately. "Lou," he said, stepping forward with unexpected warmth. "My God, it's been years." "I figured you might remember," Lou replied, shaking his hand. "You still owe me for that week in Fairbanks with the snowstorm," Gregory laughed. "I still tell that story." And then his eyes shifted to Claire. "You must be Ms. Harper," she nodded, guarded. "I've read your letters, your emails. I'm sorry for not replying sooner," he said, "but I needed time. Because there's something I have to tell you, he sat, his expression sobering. 6 years ago, during the Haven Creek flood, I was there, on a business trip, got caught in the rising water, trapped in my car. A dog came through the flood to get me out. Claire froze. He broke the window, Gregory said, grabbed my jacket, dragged me out, through chest-high current. I couldn't believe it was real. The handler. He didn't make it. Jake Wells, Claire whispered. Gregory nodded. I didn't know the dog's name until your article, until I saw the photo. It was him. Rocco saved my life too. Silence settled over the table. Then Gregory leaned forward. I can't undo what's been done, but I can help now. You have my attention and my support. Claire looked between the two men, the old trainer and the rescued executive. One had shaped Rocco. The other had been saved by him, and both were now standing beside her. The misfit Pitbull had done more than rescue people. He'd forged bonds across age, class, and power. You asked why I'm still fighting, she said quietly. This is why. The morning Rocco died, the sun filtered softly through the dogwood tree outside Claire's cottage, casting broken light across the living room where he lay. His breath had grown shallow overnight, his eyes dull, yet still somehow holding that unwavering loyalty Claire had come to rely on for 6 long years. She didn't cry, not at first. She had known this day would come, despite his brief recovery, despite the cautious optimism that had grown in her heart when he started eating again, walking again, nudging her elbow with his nose like he used to deep down. She knew the damage inside him had been too great, too far gone to reverse. The toxins from the Canadex G medication had set something into motion that even love couldn't undo. Claire had spent the entire night beside him, curled on the floor, whispering memories into his ear like bedtime stories for a child. She told him about the flood again, about the moment she thought she would die until she felt his teeth gently catch her sleeve and pull. She told him how she'd survived the days that followed, only because he never left her side. She told him he was her whole heart. When he finally exhaled that last long breath and fell still, Claire pressed her forehead to his and whispered, It's okay, Rocco. You can rest now. She buried him under the dogwood tree just before noon. It was the same spot where he used to stretch out in the sun, belly to the earth, head tilted to catch the breeze. She wrapped him in his favorite fleece blanket and placed the chewed-up tennis ball beside him. Then, with trembling hands, she slid the folded letter she'd written him weeks earlier into the grave, the same letter she once thought she'd read to him during euthanasia, but never did. Now it was his alone. The grief that followed was like a tidal wave, slow and quiet at first, then crashing into everything. Claire stopped answering calls. She ignored messages from Dr. Morgan, from Lou, from the reporters who still wanted to talk about the investigation. The cottage fell into silence. Meals went untouched. Lights remained off, even after sunset. The only sound was the creak of old wood and the wind through the eaves. On the third day, while searching for an old photograph of Rocco, Claire opened a storage box marked with his name. Inside were his collar, his puppy tags, a series of training certificates, and at the very bottom, a small, gnawed-on plastic card half hidden under a pile of frayed leashes. She nearly passed it over until she noticed the name printed in faded ink near the bottom, Gregory Harmon. It was an old rescue ID, the kind used by state-level emergency teams. Claire blinked, then sat down hard on the floor. She remembered that name, Gregory Harmon, the current CEO of BioPetra, the pharmaceutical giant behind Canadex G, the same man who, in a private meeting weeks earlier, had revealed that he too had been saved from the Haven Creek flood by a German Shepherd K9, by Rocco. Claire's hands shook as she held the card. Piecing it together, Rocco hadn't just saved her that day, he'd saved Harmon too. And now, years later, the same man was unknowingly leading a company whose negligence had cost Rocco his life. She couldn't ignore the symmetry. The dog who had pulled them both from death had become the link between them once more, but this time, it wasn't about survival, it was about justice Claire stood up, clutching the old card like a talisman. Something ignited inside her, not anger. Not yet, but something close to resolve. If Rocco had left her anything, it was purpose, a direction, a reminder that survival was never the end of the story. The next morning, Claire drafted a letter, not a private one, like the one she'd buried with Rocco, but a public one, an open letter addressed to BioPetra, to pet owners across the country, to lawmakers and journalists, and anyone who had ever looked into the eyes of a dog and felt understood. She included her own story, Rocco's story, and the investigation into Canidex G. She detailed the toxic compound, the genetic trigger, the ignored test results, the whistleblowing, and most of all, the cost. She signed it with one line, "For the dog who saved me and never stopped trying to." She posted it on a forum for veterinary professionals, then on a support group page for owners of dogs affected by Canidex G. Within hours, it was shared thousands of times. Local news picked it up, then national. Within 2 days, Claire was interviewed live on a morning show watched by millions of Americans. Her voice cracked when she said Rocco's name, but she didn't look away from the camera. And somewhere in a tall glass building downtown, Gregory Harmon read her letter and wept. Later that week, Claire received a handwritten note in the mail, no return address, but the signature was unmistakable. Gregory Harmon. The letter was short. "I never knew it was the same dog," he wrote, "but I should have listened sooner. If there's anything I can do to make this right, tell me, not as a CEO, as a man who owes his life to the same four-legged soul you did." Claire stared at that letter for a long time. She didn't know yet what came next, but she knew what didn't. She wouldn't go quiet. Not now. Not ever. The days following Rocco's passing unfolded with an odd clarity. Grief was still there, tucked into every quiet moment, but something else stirred beneath it: purpose. Claire Harper hadn't just lost her best friend. She had found her reason to continue his work. A week after the dogwood tree was planted over Rocco's resting place, Claire stood in a courtroom, her hands clutching a folder of evidence. The prosecution, bolstered by new findings unearthed during the independent investigation, had issued an arrest warrant for Victor Lansing, former head of pharmaceutical development at BioPetra. Victor's smug confidence had evaporated under the weight of whistleblower testimonies, internal memos, and Claire's data. He now faced multiple charges: corporate fraud, criminal negligence, tampering with medical records, and obstruction of a federal investigation. But it wasn't just about taking one man down, it was about changing the system that had allowed him to thrive unchecked. As the legal machinery churned forward, Claire, Dr. Twell, Morgan, Mr. Liu, and Gregory Harmon met in the sunlit lobby of BioPetra's former research annex. Harmon had since stepped down as CEO but stayed on in a consulting role, his remorse now channeled into tangible reform. Together, they unveiled something new: the Rocco Foundation. It wasn't just a name, it was a promise. The Rocco Foundation would be the country's first independently operated veterinary medication watchdog, one not tied to pharmaceutical profits, but to public service. It was a place where science met transparency, where the people most affected by pet health decisions had a seat at the table. At its core, the Foundation's charter was simple: no animal would be harmed by hidden ingredients, poor testing, or greed ever again. But that wasn't all. Claire, inspired by Lou's quiet wisdom and Harmon's resource connections, proposed a second branch of the foundation, a sanctuary for retired service dogs and senior citizens living alone, a place where the aged, whether two-legged or four, could find purpose and companionship again. Dogs like Rocco had given their lives to service. They deserved comfort, not kennels. And elders like Lou, they deserved the kind of friendship that only a dog can offer. Word spread fast. Donations poured in from across the country, many anonymous, many with handwritten notes. For Daisy, gone too soon. For Boomer, he saved me once. For the one who never barked, but always knew. Former 9 handlers, retired military vets, grieving pet owners all found solace in the mission. On the day of the grand opening, Sunlight filtered through the big bay windows of the center's community hall. There were photos of Rocco everywhere, training in flood gear, napping under Claire's desk, tugging a rope toy with Marcus, the boy Claire had once helped fund for life-saving surgery. And then, there he was again, Marcus, now nearly 9, bright-eyed and walking proudly toward Claire with something wriggling in his arms. "I brought someone," he said, his voice filled with the kind of reverence children reserve for truly important moments. "It was a puppy. This is Scout," Marcus said. "He was rescued from one of the shelters that used to get shipments from that Canadex G place. He needed someone, and Mom says I needed someone too." Claire crouched down, gently brushing her fingers over Scout's soft fur. The little dog licked her hand, tail wagging furiously, oblivious to the history he now stepped into. "You've got big paws to fill, little one," she whispered, her voice catching. "Let's begin again." The room erupted into quiet applause as Scout bounced in place, Marcus beaming beside him. That night, Claire sat alone in her garden, the dogwood tree glowing under string lights they'd hung for the ceremony. In her lap, Scout slept soundly, his breathing slow and even. She traced the edge of the photo on the stone marker Rocco, in his prime, eyes locked with hers like he had always understood more than he could ever say. "Doctor, new legislation's already in draft. Mandatory disclosure, independent review panels, all of it." Claire looked out into the quiet night. "He changed the world without ever saying a word. He may be gone, Dr. Twir," Morgan said, resting a hand on her shoulder, "but his legacy has just begun." Somewhere inside, Claire felt a peace she hadn't known in years, not because the pain had faded, but because she had found something stronger to carry it. He'd saved her again and again through grief, through doubt, through hopelessness. Now it was her turn. The foundation had a long road ahead, but as Scout stirred in her lap, pressing closer in sleep, Claire knew one truth. They weren't doing this alone. Rocco's paw prints were etched into every brick of this place. And as long as dogs like him kept saving lives and people like Claire kept telling their stories, the future was something worth fighting for. She looked up at the stars, whispering to the night, "We're not done yet, partner." And somewhere, in the wind, she thought she heard a single bark, just once, just enough. If this story touched something deep within you, don't just scroll past, leave a comment, share your thoughts, and subscribe to Veilmarks. 1,000 subscribers isn't just a number, it's a lifeline for this channel to keep telling stories that matter. Stories like Rocco's that remind us love isn't always loud, but it's always true. As Mr. Fred Rogers once said, anything that's human is mentionable, and anything that is mentionable can be more manageable. Through storytelling, we heal. Through memory, we honor. Thank you for watching. And remember, what you've just seen is more than an ending. It's a beginning for Rocco, for Claire, and maybe for all of us.